I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast, and I've got the three biggest factors that I see that could fix the Steelers' offensive line this year and turn them from being very meh last year to very this year. We'll talk about that and more right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button on this video. And if you enjoy it, hit the subscribe button to our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content and sometimes we have breaking news updates right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. As always, and always remember, if you want to check us out, we're on all those different platforms. Give us a 5-star review with a positive comment on Apple Podcasts. Do both at the same time. I get you a shout out at the end of the show. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, now that that's been said, I want to talk to you guys about the offensive line today. We talked a lot about the defense. We talked a lot about the Larry Ogunjobi, Minkah Fitzpatrick, all these signings last week. We've done a lot about that. We've talked about Deontay Johnson, but the offensive line is, of course, a huge part of what the Steelers need to be this year, need to improve on this year. So I've got three things that I see being the biggest factors to the offensive line taking that step forward. I'm not saying top 10 offensive line or even top 15. Just get around that get around mid-level area. Like, even if you're the 18th, 19th best offensive line, I know that's not a stat that's a thing, but I'm saying if you're one of the decent offensive lines of the NFL, that's going to help with the Steelers a lot with the playmakers that they have on offense, whether it's Najee Harris, Pat Freiermuth, Pickens, Johnson, Claypool, all those guys with their new young quarterbacks and Mitch Trubisky and Kenny Pickett and everybody, and the defense. And I do think the defense is in a position where they could get back to being a top 5 unit this year. However, the offensive line has three things to do. Chief among them is that James Daniels has to be the leader that he's being talked about to be. Now, I've brought this up several times over now. When I first walked into the OTA's locker room back in May, when the Steelers were meeting and hanging out, and guys are getting to fill each other out. James Daniels, the free agent that they signed from the Chicago Bears, everyone was talking to him like, oh yeah, that's the leader of the offensive line now. And there's excitement behind that, right? Because last year they were hoping that leader was going to be DeCastro. Then he finds out he's not going to play. They have to bring in Trey Turner. Trey Turner's kind of the leader, but it doesn't really stick. James Daniels is a 24-year-old guy who's had some really good years in the NFL. He's played 4 years, so he has the experience. He has the youth. There's some offensive linemen that are coming into the league at his age. I really see this potential for him being a guy. But what triggers it for me when I think leadership, and I think what you need from a guy to set a new tone for an offensive line that doesn't have any of the pieces of the great offensive lines of Steelers past, whether it was David DeCastro of the 2000 or David DeCastro of the last year with Marquise Pouncey of the last decade, or Alan Faneck or any of the guys of the decade before that. There's no remnants of that have snuck through from the Steelers' best offensive line days. But James Daniels, one thing that I hear when I hear him talk about football, I hear him talk about Pat Meyer, the new offensive line coach, is how Pat Meyer is addressing them. And he talks about, hey, like, I've played left guard, right guard, and center. And it does matter how a coach talks to you about what your weaknesses and what your strengths are. And he says Pat Meyer individually is able to break each of us down for our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think that is a key factor here, is that, one, Pat Meyer is a big part of this, but two, on the field, James Daniels, if he's a guy that can understand that, and he's a guy who can lift other guys up around him, I think that's a big factor here. My second factor is the chemistry. It's not just one player. It's the chemistry between Kevin Dotson and Dan Moore Jr. Now, this presumes a lot of things. One, it presumes that Kevin Dotson wins the left guard position over Kendrick Green, which we have now acknowledged on this show and where I write SteelersNow.com, that there is a current battle between Kendrick Green and Kevin Dotson. Both have said they're both splitting the snaps 50-50 right now in minicamp and OTAs, so we need to see how that develops. But Kevin Dotson before last year was looking like he could have been the guy at left guard. He got hurt, things didn't work out. He was adjusting from right guard to left guard, needed to find his comfort zone, and then he got hurt and wasn't able to get back out there. But there's excitement behind the idea of he can be one of the better stronger guards or stronger players on this offensive line. So there's excitement behind that. And then there's excitement around having Dan Moore Jr. with a second year to kind of continue developing at the left tackle position. Now, some people will say Dan Moore Jr. is a guard, but I see these two as being a big factor here, because if these two guys can be part of what the Steelers want to do in a power setting and working together, I think this gets something the Steelers that they haven't had since, Pouncey and DeCastro were in their best days. And that's a strong 1-2 punch next to each other, because one thing that Pouncey and DeCastro really had was when guys lined up in between them, when they were able to communicate and blow guys off the ball, work around, pull lead block, do what they needed to do. The chemistry was there. The fire was there. And the more I talk to these guys, the more I get a sense that, like, if there's a combo for that type of chemistry to happen, it's going to be from Dotson and Dan Moore Jr. And again, that's not saying that, hey, Kendrick Green might win the job and they just can't happen. But from when I talk to Kevin Dotson and he talks about Dan Moore Jr., they talk about fishing trips that they plan together and just things that they're doing. You see there's chemistry bit here. And I wanted to include a little bit of this interview. It was just, I talked to Dan Moore Jr. during minicamp for like about 4 minutes or so, but this was just a clip to give you a sense of, this is him talking about Kevin Dotson. And then there's a little bit of Okorafor jumping in with a little bit of jokes because he wants his shout out in the clip. Here's Dan Moore Jr. of the Steelers talking.
Man, it's like it's almost like we don't have to tell each other anything. We kind of just look at each other and think, you know what I'm saying? It's just like that continuity, that familiarity with him. Kevin, man, he's a beast, dude. He knows where to go and it's over with. So he makes it easy for sure.
I understand.
He's a dude, yeah. He's a beast. Let's go, Dan. Show me out, Dan. Show me out, Dan. Show me out, Dan. Damn.
Shout out to
Let's go.
Shout out to back for the 3 years. Shout out to
So, as you can see, that was Chooks playing a joke on Dan while he was talking about Kevin and just being like, oh, okay, you want to hype up your boy. I get you. But that's also a cool thing that I see about this offensive line is they seem to genuinely like each other. They seem to know each other, play jokes on each other, and every group has dynamics, but the offensive line seems to have that more than any other group, at least just sitting in the locker room, who jokes around the most when I'm in there during my availabilities and such. And I think there's value in that. But as you heard, when Dan Moore was talking about Kevin Dotson, he's like, we look at each other, we understand things. That kind of chemistry was there for Ramon Foster, was there for Alejandro Villanueva. Pouncey was able to set that with the whole line. If those two can start that trend and build that, and it gets to Mason Cole, who's supposed to start at center, and it gets to James Daniels, and that gets to Chooks, I think that's all a huge factor in how this plays out. But I think the third biggest factor is a thing that is what I mentioned briefly earlier in this, and it's not about one of the players, it's about the coach, Pat Meyer. Now, I've heard good things, but I also was hearing good things last year about Adrian Clem, and he left in the middle of the season for Oregon. But the big thing that I've heard is the distinction between Adrian Clem last year and Pat Meyer this year. One, Adrian Clem was a first time. This was his first big job as far as an offensive line coach in the NFL. And what we were hearing all minicamp last year, all training camp, he wants us to be more physical. He wants us to be stronger. He wants us to be mean. And that's cool. But it seemed like that was the big note there. And when I asked Kevin Dotson for a difference there, he noted like, hey, like, there, we are trying to be mean, but now we're more pointed in how we do so. We're more strategic for when we are doing that and how we attack those situations. So I see a difference in that. And I also see with Pat Meyer, this is being a big difference from how they can improve last year. If what James Daniels said is true, if Pat Meyer is the kind of veteran coach, and he's been an offensive line coach in different parts of the league, he was just with the Carolina Panthers. If he can be the kind of coach that works with Kevin Dotson and says, hey, you got to be sharper on the left side, and works with Okorafor and says, hey, your footwork is great over here, but you need to be meaner. You need to be able to get more physical in the run game. We need you to set the tone a little bit earlier. Don't let guys get into your pad level before you start to hit them with your punch. If he can help each of them identify those weaknesses, strengthen them, and make them more solid offensive linemen, then you're looking at a much more cohesive offensive line, a group that doesn't have as many weaknesses as last year's had. So I think all of those play factors into it. I think Mason Cole also would play a factor into it with how he plays at center, because there's some that think he hasn't played great at center. But there's a question that I think that one of our listeners asked that I think is very interesting to how the dynamics of this group could play out. We're going to talk about that question in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, we got to talk to you guys about BetOnline.net, which is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports information. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's Stanley Cup Finals. Now, here's the thing, y'all. I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's Game 6 tonight. I'm recording this on Sunday before Game 6, so I have no idea how this went down. I'm hoping there's a Game 7 because I hate it when it's just baseball. Not that I hate baseball, but I miss it when I love it when there's all 4 sports on. So, like, October is a happy month for me because baseball may be coming to an end, but basketball and hockey have started up. Football's going on. So if there is a Game 7, go to betonline.net. It'll help you make some money on the last piece of hockey for the rest of the year before we got to rely on baseball. But hey, baseball is in full swing, so go to betonline.net. They'll help you with those as well. It's your continued source for all your sports wagering information, live betting, playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today. Use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action when you visit BetOnline, where the game starts. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that right below. Let's keep talking offensive line here. Now, it's crazy to think this, but could the Steelers have at least one offensive lineman that develops a name so well that they get back into a national conversation with the offensive line? Because for years, I think this is one of those things that not just Steelers fans, because I do say Steelers fans get spoiled with the talent level they've had, but all NFL fans get spoiled when they start to get used to one position or one player being so good for so long. And for most of the 2010s, after like 2012, I'd say the Steelers started to really put together an offensive line. It really started to click in 2014 when Gilbert, DeCastro, and Pouncey had that time to build it up. And then you were just expecting every year, Marquise Pouncey, Pro Bowl, David DeCastro, Pro Bowl at one point. Villanueva got in that conversation. So that's an interesting part. And now the Steelers, they don't have a guy like that. They don't have a guy that just gets those votes. But is there a guy that can get in the Pro Bowl conversation? That's what Nathan Glass, our friend from Los Angeles, I was asking for the show.
How you doing, Chris? It's Nathan Glass again from California. I had a question about the offensive line. I know we're used to having Pro Bowlers on the offensive line, and I wanted to ask you, do you feel that anybody on the offensive line this year or this season can make the Pro Bowl? Thanks for taking my question, and hope to hear from you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Nathan. We do appreciate it when anyone gets a chance to call into the show. You also should remember at any point in time, you can call into the show. It's 412-223-6644 or email LOSteelersTopicBag@gmail.com. If you're international, email us an MP3 of your question. Just make sure to include, again, your name and where you're from. We like to throw that in the show as well. But Nathan's question, I don't expect the Steelers player to make the Pro Bowl. Now, part of this is politics because there were plenty of years Marquise Pouncey should not have been in the Pro Bowl but he was voted in because a lot of fans, when they do the voting and there's stuff, it's kind of pedigree. If you're a good offensive lineman or a great offensive lineman, we've known you to be one, we're going to vote you in. But there were some years where Marquise Pouncey definitely wasn't the best center in the AFC or one of the top centers in the league at that point in time during the later part of his years, but he would get in on name alone. And that's a factor that works both ways. It's great for the guys who are established, but it stinks for the young up-and-coming guys who might have made a difference. So if I was to pick any one guy, it would definitely be James Daniels. I talked about him as a leader. I think he can be a versatile player, but I think that they want to stick him at right guard, let him be like the powerhouse of the group that kind of everyone gels around and brings it together. Now, here's one thing that I've seen over the years. Steelers fan voting for Pro Bowls does kick in when fans, there was at one point where John Bostic was the leading vote getter at the start of the Pro Bowl sitting for the linebacker. And I was just like, holy moly. Now, of course, that didn't last because John Bostic had a strong start to that year. I believe that was 2018 when he had that start to the year. And then as soon as teams realized, oh, wait, we should throw at him, then, his play went down. And then the Steelers fans were like, yeah, okay, we're gonna cut that out. We're not going to vote for him as much. But when it comes to the voting and the respect, a lot of it comes from guys who are just like, oh, yeah, that guy over there, because people don't pay as much attention to offensive linemen. It's different. When a wide receiver gets 1,800 yards, everyone's like, oh, that guy over there. But an offensive lineman who has, 10 pancakes, and hasn't let a single guy get past him and touch his quarterback, that might be harder to notice and harder to talk about. People don't talk about that as much. It's not as fun, I guess, for a lot of people. But James Daniels has that potential. One thing I see that could play in his factor is that he didn't make any Chicago Bears fan mad. They were disappointed, but they were like, hey, we respect it, James. You got to go where you got to go. Management has been terrible for the Bears. So, there might be people that say, hey, we like James Daniels from the Chicago side. And if he is leading the charge and Najee Harris is having a phenomenal year and you need a face of the Steelers offensive line to vote for, maybe he does get that vote. And maybe he becomes that guy that kind of steps up into that situation. And I think it would really be really cool for the Steelers to have that guy that everyone can kind of circle and say, oh, yeah, he is the new face of the Steelers offensive line. Again, he's 24 years old. So he has a name in the NFL and he's young, so that has more time to build on it. So to answer your question, Nathan, that would be my top guy. But let's explore across the board here. I don't expect Mason Cole to be that. I think that if he fits in, he's going to be kind of the center placeholder, because and I've talked to Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings. We've talked about this, and he's told me how he never felt like Mason Cole was most comfortable at center. His hands weren't up quick enough to handle the situation. But he's a comparable lineman. He's a guy that works on details. He's a veteran for a reason. He's not a guy that's just going to slack off in his job. I do think that he's going to be solid, but I think a lot of what is going to make him solid is how good the line's around him. He's not going to be a guy that I think lifts up the group, more as like a glue piece that puts the best parts of the group together. Now, that guy, another guy that could factor in here is Okorafor. Now, you're probably thinking, Chris, you're crazy, but Okorafor is a guy who, again, like Daniels, 24 years old, been around the league, has a rep. He has shut down Von Miller on occasion. He has played very well in pass protection. But what has to happen somewhere along the line, and I put Kevin Dotson and Dan Moore, as I said in the last segment in this, there has to be somebody that sets a tone in the run game to be able to say, hey, I'm the physical force here. And Najee, and the Steelers can feel like, hey, we're running Najee Harris behind this gap because this lineman is over here. For years, the Steelers had the play where they pull, 2 guards or a center and a guard or a tackle and a guard, and they would go out and lead block for guys, and that was their play. Najee Harris might not get that play. That was a Todd Haley thing, but there needs to be offensive linemen, and maybe it is Dotson and Moore, and maybe Dotson could be in that conversation for, hey, if he has a really strong year, maybe he surges up the votes and gets a Pro Bowl nod. But that's why I'm thinking James Daniels, and maybe even if James Daniels is having this big of a kind of year where he's bringing that, maybe Okorafor gets that chemistry with him, and the two of them become the guys that build a chemistry. And Najee Harris, the Steelers run Najee Harris behind them a lot, but I'm not so sure that even if this offensive line takes the step forward, and let's say they get to top 15 in the NFL or even top 12, I'm still not saying top 10. I just don't see that at all for them, because we had Brian Batko of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on the show 2 weeks ago, and when we did, he brought up what I agreed with, and he said the Steelers didn't do enough to add to this offensive line in the offseason. They had a lot of other projects to fix. They needed to get 2 new quarterbacks. They needed to re-up the wide receiver position, re-up the defensive line position. They've addressed a lot of those things, re-up at linebacker as well. So offensive line, they got one guy, James Daniels. They brought back Okorafor, and they got Mason Cole. They did an okay job, but I think they still need to, in the long run, they're going to need another ace or another anchor type of piece to this offensive line moving forward. But here's the thing, is if they're able to get at least one of these 3 guys, or one of any one of these guys on the 5, but I really think it comes down to the best chances James Daniels, maybe Okorafor because of his reputation, or a Kevin Dotson. But any one of those guys becomes the power guy that you see on camera, bullying defensive linemen, creating the rushing lanes for Najee Harris to go through, having the pancakes on the big moments. Those are going to be the defining moments that I think gets more people's attention, because those are the type of things that Pouncey and DeCastro did that got them their reputation. You just see DeCastro just bullying Vontaze Burfict over the middle. You see Marquise Pouncey pulling and blocking, blowing up a guy in space. Those are the things that when you're watching Sunday Night Football and the announcer says, "Whoa, that's amazing," and then you see it back on SportsCenter and then everyone's talking about it. that boosts your pedigree and that gets you more names. And, Marcus Gilbert is a perfect example of a lineman who never got any credit, never made a Pro Bowl. Yet when he was in the game, I apologize, I'm not Dale Lally. He had this stat down pat like 3 or 4 years ago when we were talking about Marcus Gilbert. When he was in, the Steelers run game was a completely different force, because to me, the anchors were always Pouncey, DeCastro, and Gilbert as a trio on the right side. Foster was very good. Villanueva was very good. They would hold down the left side. But you got behind those three, teams had a big problem. And I think that that's something. But Marcus Gilbert is a guy that he bullied people for years, but he didn't have the big name. He didn't, get the recognition. He was another guy who shut down Von Miller, a future Hall of Famer, all 2010s decade team type of guy. And he played him pretty well, but he never got the credit, never got a Pro Bowl, and it's a shame because he was a heck of a player for the Pittsburgh Steelers before the injuries really took his career from him a little bit sooner than people hoped. But again, to answer your question, Nathan, I'm saying James Daniels is my top answer. I know that's an easy one to pick at because I talked about him as a leader, but I really think if he can do that, it's part of what lifts up the rest of the team. We got a question about the defense in just a minute. We're going to talk about that right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, and we're continuing our discussion here on the Monday episode, bringing you back. Now, we've talked about it a lot about the offensive line, but there are a lot of questions about what the Steelers could do with the rest of their free agency money. Now, we do know, again, the Larry Ogunjobi contract took a maximum of $8 million. That's plus incentives. So I realize, I think I said this in a way that might have confused listeners. The $8 million is the most that he can make, even if his incentives kick in all the way. So his contract is not going to take up all that all that $8 million that we're talking about there. So the Steelers are in a pretty good place right now, again, for their cap space. You're looking at a team right now that still should have around, top 10 in the most money to spend right now. So again, I think that's a very good place to be when you're looking at the situation. And we're still waiting for the exact details on Larry Ogunjobi's contract. But I still think, $8 million incentives is great. But where else can they use that money? And last week I had Doran Dickerson on, former NFL tight end and Pitman himself. And he came on talking about backup running back. But there's another backup position that's very important, and it's not exactly settled. We had this question from our friend Tim Wheeler in England asking about a specific position that the Steelers could address.
Hi, Chris. My name's Tim Wheeler from Melton Mowbray, England. I'm an avid listener of the Locked On podcast and love the show. I have a question about a depth position that hasn't been addressed during the off-season, and that's edge rusher. I don't see how anyone can expect Watt and Highsmith to make it through a whole season with no injury issues, and even if they do, they're going to need to be spelled during games. So who do you see on the current roster who is the next man up, or do you think the Steelers need to add? Thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, Tim. Always appreciate calls. And again, if you're international like Tim is, he sent me an email, LOSteelersTopicBag@gmail.com. You can always send me an email with the MP3 if you're international and you don't want to pay fees to call a number in the US. But hey, we appreciate it. And again, out in England, we got Steelers fans everywhere. Steeler Nation is everywhere. So remember that, Steelers fans, you're not alone. Whenever you're traveling, Google up Steelers Bar where you're at to see if you're somewhere abroad and you just want to see where a new place might be. And you're like, oh, I might make some friends over there. But to answer Tim's question, the Steelers do have answers there, or at least potential answers there, hopes there that could work out at the backup edge rusher position. Now, the players I pictured, if you're watching on YouTube and I put up the card of the players I used, first was Derek Tuszka, who filled in last year. And I thought for an undrafted dude that was just brought up in the team, he did pretty well. I actually thought he held his own. The middle guy is a familiar person. If you're familiar with the Steelers, especially their preseason battles, and you're familiar with this podcast, we talked a lot about him. It's Tuzar Skipper. He was brought back during minicamp this past year. And he's wearing number 53. So that number is probably going to change at some point. Because of course that's Kendrick Green's number. But But yeah, I mean, but Derek Tuszka put himself in there. Tuzar Skipper was a guy that in preseasons looked very good, then was let go, and other has bounced around the league. Now he's back with the team. They wouldn't bring him back if they didn't like him. But Tuszka had 2 sacks last year. Skipper was a guy that looked good at times, and I think he can get back there. But the other guy, of course, is the guy that they did sign in free agency, and that's Genard Avery, former outside linebacker with the Eagles. So to answer your question, Tim, right off the bat, I put Genard as the top option there because he's a veteran. He has the experience. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Derek Tuszka or Tuzar Skipper putting up a really good fight in training camp and seeing these guys battle for more reps. Now, here's the other thing. As you said, they can't afford for that kind of a question with TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. They need to spell these guys, keep them fresh, keep the bodies rotating. They got a really good chance last year with Taco Charlton coming in and having some big plays for them and filling in well. I could see the Steelers making a move here, watching other teams let go other outside linebackers, edge rusher type guys to say, hey, we're going to put you on the outside. We're going to put you out there and let you work behind Highsmith and behind Watt. And I think the other thing is that last year when they got Melvin Ingram last year, I think Melvin said, hey, I'm open to being the backup, but I think deep down he thought he would beat out Alex Highsmith, and maybe he even thought he did beat out Alex Highsmith. But as a person who could tell you, when I saw both of those guys work, he did not beat out Alex Highsmith. And Alex Highsmith is a heck of a player. Also, congratulations to Alex Highsmith. He got married over this past weekend. Hit him up on his Twitter account because it was some very nice pictures, and now they're on their honeymoon. So congratulations to them. But again, Highsmith Watt, very important duo to this team. And they need to keep these guys fresh. You need to keep these guys fresh with guys that you can feel comfortable spelling, taking over for a series or two during a game. And I think Genard Avery could be there. Now, we didn't get to talk to him during minicamp and OTAs. Just wasn't available. Didn't happen. Maybe that happens during training camp. We get to see this guy in full action, but he's a veteran. We'll see how that plays out. But Skipper and Tuszka each look like guys that could be those practice squad guys that step up, get better at their game, and kind of give you the effect of like, hey, these are the scrappers that earn their spot on the team. I still think the Steelers need a definitive veteran that's going to be like cool with running those backups. That's kind of like, hey, I'm the guy that comes in for these guys, and we're going to play to this level because this is the standard that's expected of us. If the Steelers find that guy, I think they're in a great spot. I think that they put themselves in an awesome position to have that rotation on the edge. But Tim, it's a very smart question because the Steelers do need this to work out. They do need an edge rushing, I guess, what you call it, quartet, I guess that you would say, because you need 4. I'd want 4 guys on the Steelers. So a quartet or a quintet even, getting a pass rush going off the edge. And again, keeping TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith free. I know that he's not the defensive coordinator anymore, but Keith Butler always said this when I asked him about it. And he would say, we want our defensive stars to be the freshest and ready to go in the early part of the fourth quarter, because that's when things start to turn. And that's when the mistakes start to get made. That's when you've seen that their offense, they've seen your defense several times over. And now the playmaking starts to come out and have the biggest impact on the game. So you want to make sure that, hey, in the second quarter and third quarter, when your guys are going back and forth, that you're winning downs, but you're not winning downs just because TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith have been playing 95% of the snaps. That's easier to do for a safety or a cornerback, because they're not hitting somebody every single play like a defensive lineman, an offensive lineman, an edge rusher. Those guys, the offensive linemen, I guess it is easy to do for them because they do it all the time. But defensive, it's just a different thing to request of them. So again, Tim, to answer your question, Genard Avery right now, Tuszka and Skipper are your guys that are going to be battling back there. But I truly do think that if the Steelers get through training camp, or even the first couple weeks of training camp, and they get to their first preseason game, and they're not happy with who they see, they start looking around. And I keep floating this out there. If Kenny Pickett is solidified as the number 2 quarterback, and Mason Rudolph becomes an attractive piece for some team to want to trade for because they desperately need an NFL quarterback arm, this is another position that you could say, hey, we'll give you our backup quarterback. You give us a depth edge rusher guy that's a veteran. Swap for swap, bing, bang, boom. You got an answer for a position that you don't have an answer for now. But it does need to happen. I agree with Tim entirely. And I think, again, I don't think the Steelers rush into this situation. I think that they say, hey, let's bring these guys to camp and just see how they do. And then, again, the pads will go on. We'll see backs on backers. We'll see like 2 weeks of practices. We'll probably see a preseason game, kind of like how they did Robert Spillane last year, where he played a preseason game or two, and then they said, oh, okay, no, Joe Schobert, please come here. And they traded to get him. And I think that will be a situation that you see the Steelers roll into. But that's the situation with the backup edge rusher. Thanks again, Tim Wheeler, for your question all the way from England. Thanks again, Nathan Glass, for your question all the way from Los Angeles, California. And thanks again to you, our dear listeners and viewers on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. I'm Chris Carter, host of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Find me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Find this show and all the places I just mentioned. Also, if you want to help out the show even further, go out go on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review with a positive comment, do both at the same time, and you get a special shout at the end of the show, like this person who says, new listeners, 5 stars, just recently came across this podcast and have been really enjoying it. I will be looking forward to new episodes as training camp approaches. Chuck Hakes, Scranton, PA. Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate the 5-star review. We just had another one that we read last Friday. Thanks to everyone who does leave 5-star reviews. And hey, if you've already left one, leave another one with a positive comment. Get you a shout out at the end of the show. Thanks again. We'll be back tomorrow talking more about your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.